Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring one of the most baffling and haunting unsolved murder sprees in American history. A killer who struck in the dead of night, vanished without a trace, and then wrote a letter to an entire city, threatening death, but promising to spare anyone who played jazz music loud enough. Who does that? Who kills with an axe, disappears into the shadows of New Orleans, and then taunts an entire city through the newspaper? Here's what happened. It is March 13, 1919. The city of New Orleans is already on edge. For nearly a year, residents have been locking their doors, boarding up their back panels, and lying awake in the dark listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. A killer has been moving through their neighborhoods, striking without warning, leaving behind horror and questions and almost no useful evidence. And the New Orleans Police Department has been chasing shadows. Then, on that March morning, something extraordinary happens. The New Orleans Times-Picayune publishes a letter. And this letter does not come from a detective, or a witness, or a concerned citizen. It claims to come from the killer himself. The letter opens with a declaration that the writer is not a human being, but a spirit, a demon from the hottest hell. It is theatrical, grandiose, and deeply unsettling. But then it gets stranger. The writer declares that on the following Tuesday night, March 19, 1919, he will again pass over New Orleans. And he will spare any household, any home, that is playing jazz music at midnight. Every home that is not playing jazz, he writes, will be visited by him. And those within will not be so fortunate. Think about that for a moment. A suspected serial killer has just issued a city-wide ultimatum. Play jazz, or face the consequences. And here is the thing that makes this case so enduringly strange. The city played jazz. Every ballroom, every dance hall, every parlor and front porch that could push music into the night air did exactly that on March 19, 1919. The city of New Orleans essentially threw a city-wide jazz party, terrified into celebration by an anonymous letter from a suspected murderer. And no attacks were reported that night. None, not a single one. Whether that silence was because of the jazz, or because of the massive police presence, or because the letter was never actually from the killer at all, that question has never been answered. Not then, not now, not more than 100 years later. This is the story of the Axeman of New Orleans. A killer who struck at least a dozen people across the city of New Orleans between 1918 and 1919. Who targeted victims in their own homes. Who left behind a method that was almost ritualistic in its consistency. And who was never identified, never charged, and never brought to justice. To understand why this case shook New Orleans to its foundations, you need to understand the city itself in 1918. New Orleans in that era was one of the most vibrant, densely populated, and culturally distinct cities in the United States. It was a port city, a melting pot, a place where cultures and languages and traditions collided and blended in ways that happened almost nowhere else in America at that time. It was also the birthplace of jazz, a musical form that was still young, still raw, still bursting out of the corner bars and dance halls of the city's most lively neighborhoods. It was also a city dealing with the anxieties of a world at war. 1918 was the final year of the First World War. Men were overseas. Families were stretched thin. And on top of the global catastrophe, a flu pandemic was beginning to sweep the globe. New Orleans, like every major American city, was already frightened. And into that fear, the Axeman arrived. The Italian-American community, particularly Italian-American grocers and shop owners, would find themselves at the center of a terror that defied easy explanation. Many of the victims ran small grocery stores or similar businesses from their homes, living in the back or upstairs while their shops occupied the front of the building. This was a common arrangement for immigrant families who had come to New Orleans seeking opportunity, and who had built their modest livelihoods through hard work and close community ties. Now let's go back to the beginning. The beginning of the attacks as investigators and historians have most thoroughly documented them. May 23, 1918. A warm night in New Orleans, as nights in late May tend to be. Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were at home in their residence, where Joseph ran a grocery store out of the front of the building. They were ordinary people, hardworking, part of the Italian-American community that had built deep roots in New Orleans over the preceding decades. By all accounts, they had no extraordinary enemies. No known disputes that would explain what happened to them. That night, someone entered their home. The manner of entry was something that investigators would note carefully and would see repeated again and again in the weeks and months ahead. A panel in the back door had been chiseled out. Not forced open, not kicked in, carefully, methodically chiseled, creating an opening large enough for a person to reach through or pass through. The tool used for this entry was believed to be a chisel. The weapon used inside the home was an axe. Joseph and Catherine Maggio were found by Joseph's brothers, Andrew and Jake, early the following morning. Both had been attacked. Both were fatally injured. Catherine Maggio died from her injuries. Joseph Maggio survived only briefly before also succumbing. The axe used in the attack was found on the premises. It belonged to the Maggios themselves. The killer had apparently taken it from somewhere on or near the property. Investigators arrived and began their work. The New Orleans Police Department documented the scene and noted that odd detail about the chiseled door panel. They also found something written in chalk on the pavement nearby, a fragment of what appeared to be a message or notation. The exact nature of the chalk writing and its significance was debated at the time, and no definitive connection to the killer was ever established from it. What investigators did note was that the method of entry, that carefully chiseled back door panel, was unusual. Deliberate, patient. Andrew and Jake Maggio were initially questioned by police. This was standard investigative practice. The family members who discover a crime are among the first to be examined. Andrew Maggio reportedly had blood-stained clothing, which drew temporary suspicion. But investigators were unable to build a case against either brother, and no charges were filed. The investigation of the Maggio killings remained open. Here's where this case begins to feel different from an ordinary murder investigation. The attack on the Maggios was terrible and shocking on its own. But it was not a singular event. It was a beginning. June 27, 1918. Just over a month after the Maggio attack. Louis Bassumer, a grocer, and a woman named Harriet Lowe, who was staying with him, were attacked in their home. Again, the back door panel. Chiseled out, the same method. Investigators noted the similarity immediately. Louis Bassumer survived. Harriet Lowe did not. She ultimately died from her injuries some months later, in August 1918. The Bassumer case became one of the most complicated and troubled threads of the entire Axeman investigation. Because suspicion fell, at various points, on Louis Bassumer himself. Accusations were made. Arrests occurred. Bassumer was charged and ultimately tried for the attack. And then, in 1919, he was acquitted. A jury found him not guilty. Whatever the truth of that night, the legal system could not establish Bassumer's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and he was released. The attacks did not stop while investigators were focused on Bassumer. August 5, 1918, Anna Schneider, a pregnant woman, was attacked in her home. She survived. Her infant was later delivered safely. But the attack terrified a city that was already frightened and added another data point to a growing and deeply troubling pattern. August 10, 1918, just 5 days after the Schneider attack, Joseph Romano, another Italian-American grocer, was attacked in his home. His nieces, Pauline and Mary Bruno, reportedly heard sounds and glimpsed a large, dark figure leaving the room. Joseph Romano died from his injuries within 2 days. The investigators noted, again, the chiseled door panel. The pattern was now impossible to ignore. Now, I want to ask you something. And I genuinely want you to think about this. You are a resident of New Orleans in August 1918. At least 3 people are dead: Catherine Maggio, Harriet Lowe, Joseph Romano. Others have been seriously injured. The police have not identified a suspect. The attacks are happening at night, in homes just like yours, in neighborhoods just like yours. What do? Do you leave? Do you stay and arm yourself? Do you reinforce your doors? And here is the question that haunted the community most of all: why these families? Why grocers? Why Italian Americans? Drop your theory in the comments, because this targeting pattern is one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. The question of why so many victims were Italian American grocers generated enormous amounts of speculation, both at the time and in the centuries since. Some investigators and commentators in 1918 and 1919 suggested connections to organized crime, specifically to extortion schemes targeting Italian American business owners, a practice sometimes called the Black Hand. The Black Hand was a form of extortion that some organized crime elements had used against immigrant communities, particularly Italian immigrants, in several American cities during this era. The theory went that perhaps the victims had refused to pay, or had cooperated with authorities against extortionists, and had been targeted in retaliation. This theory was never proven. No specific evidence connecting the Axeman attacks to organized crime extortion was established by investigators at the time. And the targeting pattern, while it did cluster around Italian American grocers, was not perfectly consistent, not all victims fit that profile precisely. But the theory persisted in the press and in public conversation, because people needed an explanation. When something this terrible happens, and the police have no answers, people reach for frameworks that make at least some kind of sense. There is another possible explanation for the grosser connection that is more practical and less sinister. Grocery stores of that era were often attached to or incorporated into residential spaces. Families lived where they worked. This meant that the layout of those homes, the back doors, the storage areas, the physical structure, may have been more familiar, more predictable, more accessible to someone who had studied or cased those locations. A person who knew the typical layout of a New Orleans corner grocery would know where the back door was. Would know that the back door panel might be accessible with the right tool. Would know that the family slept in the rear of the building, near that back access point. Whether this practicality was a factor, or whether the Italian-American identity of the victims was a deliberate choice, or whether the connection was statistical coincidence amplified by press coverage that focused on certain victims, none of these possibilities was ever conclusively resolved. The Axeman left no confession, and the newspapers of 1918 and 1919, whatever their value as historical records, carried the biases and limitations of their era. After the Romano killing in August 1918, there was a period of relative quiet. Weeks passed without a reported attack. Then months. The city breathed, perhaps too soon. Investigators continued their work, but the trail was cold. No strong suspects. No reliable witnesses who could describe the attacker with enough specificity to be useful. The glimpse that Joseph Romano's nieces had caught, a large, dark figure, was suggestive but not sufficient to build a case. Then came the letter, and then the attack that followed it. But before we get to the letter and its aftermath, we need to talk about what may be the most painful and complicated episode in the entire Axeman case. An episode that reveals not just the terror the Axeman inspired, but the ways in which that terror could be exploited, with devastating consequences for innocent people. March 10, 1919, just 3 days before the famous letter appeared in the Times-Picayune. Charles Cordemelia, his wife Rosie, and their infant daughter Mary were attacked in their home in Gretna, Louisiana, just across the river from New Orleans. The Cordemelia family ran a grocery store. They were Italian-American, and the attack on their home followed what was by now a recognizable pattern. Charles Cordemelia was seriously injured but survived. Rosie Cordemelia was seriously injured but survived. Their infant daughter Mary died. Mary Cordemelia was 2 years old. The death of Mary Cordemelia is the moment in this case that strips away everything else, the mystery, the theatrics, the jazz letter, the newspaper headlines, and leaves only the plain and devastating human cost of what the Axeman did. A 2-year-old child. Dead, in her own home, and the people who did this were never held accountable. Not definitively, not in a way that held up to scrutiny or stood the test of time. Because what happened after the Cordemelia attack made a terrible situation even more terrible. From her hospital bed, Rosie Cordemelia, grieving, injured, traumatized, made an accusation. She named their neighbors, Orlando Giordano and his son Frank Giordano, as the attackers. She was certain, she said. She insisted on this identification despite the fact that her own husband Charles disputed it. Charles Cordemelia told investigators he did not believe the Giordanos were responsible. Rosie maintained her accusation. Orlando Giordano was an elderly man. Frank Giordano was a young man. Both were members of the same tight-knit community as the Cordemelias. Both denied any involvement in the attack. Both were arrested. Both were tried. And both were convicted. Orlando sentenced to life imprisonment, Frank sentenced to hang. The Giordano convictions were deeply contested at the time. Many in the community believed the accusations were false. The defense pointed to inconsistencies in Rosie Cordemelia's account and to the fact that her own husband rejected her identification of the Giordanos. But the convictions stood, for a time. Then, in December 1920, Rosie Cordemelia went to the offices of the New Orleans State's newspaper. And she recanted. She admitted that she had lied. That the Giordanos had not attacked her family. That her accusation had been false. Her stated reasons for having made the false accusation involved a personal dispute she had been having with the Giordano family at the time, a dispute that was entirely separate from the Axeman attacks. She had used the horror of what happened to her family, the death of her daughter, the trauma of her own injuries, and she had weaponized that horror against people who had not harmed her. Following Rosie Cordemelia's recantation, Orlando and Frank Giordano were released. They had been imprisoned for something they did not do. and the actual attacker who had killed Mary Cortemelia, who had nearly killed Charles and Rosie Cortemelia, was still at large. The Cortemelia case is studied not just as part of the Axeman investigation, but as a cautionary example of how trauma, grief, personal enmity, and community pressure can combine to destroy innocent people when a justice system operates without sufficient safeguards. Yolando and Frank Giordano are not peripheral figures in this story. They are central to it. Because their experience reminds us that in the shadow of a monster, sometimes terrible things are done in the name of seeking justice, and those things can be as destructive, in their own way, as the crimes that generated the fear. Now, the letter. It appeared in the New Orleans Times-Picayune on March 13, 1919. 3 days after the Cortemelia attack. The city was at its most frightened, its most raw, its most desperate for answers. And then the letter arrived, or at least, the newspaper received something that claimed to be from the killer. The letter was written in a florid, almost theatrical style. The writer described himself in supernatural terms, not a man, but a spirit, a demon, something beyond human reckoning. This was either the self-mythology of a deeply disturbed individual, or the deliberate performance of someone who wanted to be seen as supernatural and untouchable. Or, and this is something investigators and historians have considered seriously, it was written by someone who was not the Axeman at all. Someone who had followed the newspaper coverage, understood the public terror, and decided to make their own contribution to the chaos for reasons that remain unknown. The authenticity of the letter has never been established. The New Orleans Police Department, as documented in historical records and news archives of the period, could not verify that the letter came from the actual killer. There was no handwriting comparison that could be made to a known sample. There was no forensic evidence linking the letter to the crime scenes. The letter was simply a letter, received by a newspaper, published to a terrified city, and never definitively attributed to the person who had committed the attacks. But whatever its origin, the jazz ultimatum in that letter is one of the most remarkable artifacts of the entire case. Because it worked, or at least, it appeared to work. The city mobilized. Dance halls opened their doors. Musicians played. Families who had been lying awake in fear for months apparently decided that if playing jazz was the price of safety, they would pay that price enthusiastically. March 19, 1919 was reportedly one of the most musically active nights in the city's history up to that point. And the Axeman, or whoever had written that letter, did not strike. Not that night. Was it the jazz? Was it the heightened police presence that a published letter from a suspected serial killer would naturally generate? Was it that the letter was a hoax and the real Axeman had no idea it had been published? Or was it something else entirely? Was the Axeman watching from the shadows, satisfied with the spectacle he had created, with no particular intention of attacking on that night regardless of what the city did? We don't know. We genuinely do not know. And that uncertainty is part of what makes the jazz letter one of the most discussed and debated documents in the history of American true crime. It is at once chilling and darkly absurd, a serial killer, real or imagined as the author, holding a city hostage to a musical demand. The attacks did not end after March 19, 1919. Whatever the jazz night represented, a pause, a performance, a coincidence, the violence continued. August 10, 1919, exactly 1 year after the Romano attack, almost to the day. Steve Boca, a grocer, was attacked in his home. He survived. Again, the chiseled panel was present. Again, investigators had little to go on. The attack fit the pattern. It fitted so closely that investigators had to consider whether they were dealing with the same perpetrator who had struck a year earlier, had lain low for months, and had returned. Or whether someone was now imitating the original killer's method, having learned about the chiseled panels through extensive newspaper coverage. September 1919, Sarah Lauman, a young woman, was attacked in her home. She survived. This attack attracted attention in part because Lauman did not fit the profile that investigators had been working with. She was not a grocer. She was not apparently part of the Italian-American community that had been so heavily targeted. Her attack complicated the theories about ethnic targeting and occupational targeting that had dominated discussion of the case. And then, October 1919. Mike Pepitone, a grocer, attacked in his home. Mike Pepitone died from his injuries. His wife, who was in the house at the time of the attack, reported seeing a man leaving the room. Investigators recorded her account, but again, as had been the case throughout this investigation, the description was not specific enough to identify a particular individual. Mike Pepitone is generally identified in historical records and journalistic accounts as the final victim attributed to the Axeman of New Orleans. After October 1919, no further attacks matching the pattern were reported. The Axeman, whoever and whatever he was, appeared to stop. Why? Serial killers who operate in a sustained pattern do not typically simply stop. Investigators and criminologists who have studied this case in the decades since have considered several possibilities. The killer may have died, either by natural causes or by violence. The killer may have been imprisoned for an unrelated crime, taken out of circulation without anyone connecting his incarceration to the Axeman attacks. The killer may have left New Orleans, moving to another city or another state, where, if attacks occurred, they were not connected to the New Orleans case. Or, and this is a possibility that cannot be entirely dismissed, the case was never a single killer at all, and the apparent end of the attacks reflected a convergence of circumstances rather than the disappearance of one individual. Now let me ask you this, and I want you to really sit with this question. Based on everything we've covered so far, the consistent method, the chiseled panels, the axe, the nighttime attacks, the clustering around Italian-American grocers, does this evidence convince you that all of these attacks were committed by the same person? Or do you think it's possible that the Axeman was a kind of terrifying template, an original attacker who inspired copycats, or whose infamy made investigators attribute unrelated crimes to a single monster? Comment with your analysis, because serious researchers have asked exactly this question, and it matters for how we understand the case. Let us talk about the investigation itself in more depth. Because to understand why the Axeman was never caught, you have to understand what investigators were working with, and what they were working against. The New Orleans Police Department in 1918 and 1919 was operating in an era before modern forensic science. There was no DNA analysis. There was no fingerprint database in any meaningful sense. Fingerprinting was a relatively new technique, and while investigators attempted to use it, the state of the science and the infrastructure to support it were primitive by contemporary standards. There were no crime scene units with the kind of systematic, evidence preservation protocols that modern investigations take for granted. What investigators had was observation, witness testimony, and physical evidence that they could examine with their own eyes and document in written reports. The chiseled door panels were photographed and documented. The axes used in the attacks were examined. Witnesses were interviewed. Neighbors were canvassed, but the killer left very little behind that could point to a specific person. The axes themselves are worth examining for a moment. In multiple attacks, the axe used appears to have been one that belonged to the victims themselves, taken from the property used in the attack, left behind. This is a detail that investigators found significant. It suggested either that the attacker did not carry his own weapon, choosing instead to arm himself with whatever was available at the scene, or that he carried the axe to the scene and deliberately used the victim's own tool as a kind of psychological statement, or to avoid being seen in public carrying a weapon. There are practical arguments for both interpretations. A person who does not carry a weapon to the scene is less likely to be noticed approaching the target. There is no incriminating item on his person if he is stopped or questioned before the attack. He improvises with what is available. This suggests either a degree of confidence, the attacker is certain he will find a suitable weapon at the scene, or a level of planning that included knowledge of where the victim kept their tools. The chisel used to remove the door panels was also never definitively recovered in a way that could be traced to a specific individual. The method was consistent enough across attacks that investigators were confident it was the same tool, or at least the same technique, being applied repeatedly. A panel is chiseled from the lower section of a wooden door, creating an opening. This requires patience. It requires a certain physical and mechanical skill. It is not the work of someone in a frenzied, impulsive state. It is deliberate, methodical, planned. This methodical quality is one of the most discussed aspects of the Axeman's profile in historical analyses. The combination of careful entry with violent attack suggests a person who planned the approach and then acted with extreme force once inside. Whether this represents a particular psychological profile, or simply a practical strategy that this individual had developed and refined, cannot be determined at this remove. The press coverage of the Axeman case was enormous, and it shaped the investigation in ways both helpful and harmful. The New Orleans Times-Picayune and the New Orleans States, both of which are referenced in historical documentation of this case, covered the attacks extensively. This coverage kept the public informed and maintained pressure on authorities to solve the case. But it also had significant drawbacks. Extensive press coverage of the method of entry, the chiseled door panels, meant that anyone paying attention to the newspapers knew how the Axeman got in. This raised the possibility of copycat attacks, or of unrelated crimes being staged to look like Axeman attacks. It also meant that if anyone wanted to write a fake letter pretending to be the Axeman, they had all the information they needed to make it sound plausible. The press, in their very understandable drive to inform the public, may have made the investigative picture significantly murkier. The press coverage also shaped public perception of the victims in ways that were sometimes unfair. Louis Bassumer, who was accused and eventually acquitted, was subjected to intense and often hostile coverage that reflected broader anxieties of the era, including anti-immigrant sentiment and wartime suspicion of anyone perceived as foreign. At one point, accusations circulated that Bassumer was a German spy, a charge that, in 1918, carried enormous social and emotional weight. These accusations were not substantiated. Bassumer was acquitted, but the damage done to his reputation by the press coverage of that period illustrates the particular cruelty of being caught in the intersection of a major criminal investigation and a media environment that operated without many of the ethical standards that contemporary journalism aspires to. By the end of 1919, with the attacks apparently having stopped, the investigation gradually receded from the front pages. No suspect had been identified. No arrest had been made in connection with the Axeman attacks, the Giordano convictions having been overturned after Rosie Cortimilia's recantation. The case remained open, but the active, urgent investigative pressure of 1918 and 1919 dissipated. The years passed. The First World War ended. The flu pandemic ran its terrible course. The Jazz Age roared. New Orleans changed and evolved, as all cities do. And the Axeman slipped from active investigation into historical memory, into the realm of mystery that still fascinates researchers and true crime enthusiasts more than a century later. Over the decades since 1919, various theories about the identity of the Axeman have circulated among researchers, journalists, and true crime investigators. None of these theories has been confirmed by law enforcement. None has produced evidence that would meet a legal standard of proof. But they are worth examining, because they reflect the kinds of analytical frameworks that people have applied to the available evidence. One prominent line of inquiry has focused on the organized crime hypothesis, the idea that the Axeman was a professional enforcer connected to criminal networks that preyed on Italian-American communities. Under this theory, the victims who refused to cooperate with extortion demands were targeted as examples, and the axe attacks were a tool of intimidation as much as punishment. This would explain the clustering around Italian-American grocers, and it would explain why the attacks eventually stopped, if the person responsible was removed from the scene through death, imprisonment, or departure, and if the criminal organization determined that the level of law enforcement attention generated by the attacks was not worth the operational benefit. This theory has the appeal of providing a logical framework for the targeting pattern. But it has significant weaknesses as well. The attacks do not fit neatly into the pattern of organized crime enforcement that historical records document from this period. Organized crime violence tends to be calculated to achieve specific goals: a warning, a retaliation, a demonstration of power, and tends to avoid collateral victims and the kind of attention that comes from killing an entire family, including a 2-year-old child. The Axeman's attacks, in their breadth and apparent randomness within the community, seem less like targeted enforcement and more like something driven by different motivations. Another theory, one that has attracted attention in popular accounts of the case, involves a specific individual whose name has been put forward by various researchers. Without going into detail, it is important to note that no law enforcement agency has ever identified a confirmed suspect in the Axeman case. Any theory that names a specific individual remains speculative, unsourced from official records, and without the evidentiary foundation that would be required to make a credible accusation. In keeping with the standards of this program, we present the documented facts and the confirmed investigative record, and we acknowledge that anything beyond that is theory. What is documented, and what the historical record clearly establishes, is this. Between May 1918 and October 1919, a series of axe attacks occurred in New Orleans and the immediately surrounding area. At least 12 people were identified as victims in accounts sourced from newspaper archives and historical records of the period. At least 3 of those victims, Catherine Maggio, Joseph Romano, and Mary Cortimilia, died. Additional victims died from their injuries in the weeks after their attacks, including Harriet Lowe and Mike Pepitone. The attacker gained entry, in multiple documented cases, by chiseling out a panel of a back door. No individual was ever convicted in connection with these attacks. The case remains officially unsolved. The letter, that extraordinary jazz ultimatum of March 1919, remains one of the most discussed artifacts of the case, and one of the most uncertain. Historians and researchers who have examined the language and content of the letter have noted various features: the theatrical self-presentation, the specific demand involving jazz, the threats couched in supernatural language. Some have argued that the letter's very specificity about jazz, a music form that was at that time particularly associated with New Orleans's own cultural identity, suggests a writer who was deeply embedded in New Orleans's cultural life and who understood the symbolic power of invoking that particular art form. Jazz, in 1919, was not yet the globally recognized, academically celebrated art form it would become. It was a young, vital, controversial music, associated in the minds of some with immigrant communities, with the city's historically African American musical traditions, with the dance halls and social spaces that more conservative elements of New Orleans society viewed with suspicion. To demand that the city play jazz or face death was to invoke something that was itself a subject of cultural tension. Whether the letter writer understood this or cared about it, we cannot say. But the choice of jazz as the demanded activity is interesting, and it is something that researchers have never fully explained. 106 years have passed since Joseph and Catherine Maggio were attacked in their home on May 23, 1918. 106 years since the Axeman of New Orleans first made himself known to investigators and to a terrified public. The victims of these attacks, the dead and the survivors, the families who lived through it and the community that was changed by it, deserve to be remembered as people, not just as names attached to a mystery. Joseph and Catherine Maggio were a couple, running their grocery, building a life in the city they had made their home. Harriet Lowe died in August 1918 from injuries she sustained in June. She had months of suffering between the attack and her death. Joseph Romano left behind a family, including the nieces who witnessed a terrifying figure flee the room where their uncle was dying. Mary Cordemelia was 2 years old. 2 years old, Mike Pepitone was attacked and killed in his own home while his wife was in the building. She had to live with what she had seen and what she had survived for the rest of her life. These are not abstractions, they were people, and the mystery that surrounds their cases, the theatrical letter, the jazz ultimatum, the question of the chisel and the axe and the chiseled panels, none of that erases or diminishes what happened to them. The Axeman of New Orleans is remembered as one of history's most fascinating unsolved cases. But behind every fascinating detail is a human being who was harmed. The experience of the Giordano family is also worth revisiting as we near the end of this account. Orlando Giordano, an elderly man, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for a crime he did not commit. His son Frank was convicted and sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit. They were imprisoned, their lives were disrupted, their reputations destroyed. And when Rosie Cordemelia eventually told the truth, they were released, but the years they had spent in prison were not returned to them. The justice system that had failed to stop the Axeman had then turned and victimized 2 more innocent people in the chaos that the Axeman's violence had created. The Axeman case is also a story about the limits of law enforcement. The investigators of the New Orleans Police Department in 1918 and 1919 were working without the tools that modern investigators take for granted. They were working under enormous public pressure. They were operating in a city that was frightened and demanding answers. And the attacker they were pursuing was, by any assessment of the available evidence, careful, consistent, and apparently very good at not leaving traceable evidence behind. The investigation did not fail for lack of effort. It failed because the Axeman was skilled, or lucky, or both, and because the forensic science that might have identified him simply did not exist in the form that would have been necessary. There is a question worth considering as we approach the end of this account. A question about what the Axeman case reveals about the relationship between violence, culture, and memory. Because the Axeman of New Orleans has not been forgotten. He has been written about in books and articles. He has been dramatized in television productions. He has been the subject of academic inquiry and popular fascination in equal measure. The jazz letter, in particular, has taken on an almost mythological quality. It is reproduced, analyzed, and discussed constantly in true crime circles. But here is the challenge I want to put to you, as a viewer of this program who has now spent considerable time with the details of this case. Does the fascination that the Axeman generates, the theatrical quality of his apparent correspondence, the dark absurdity of the jazz ultimatum, the genuine mystery of his identity, does that fascination come at the expense of the victims? Is it possible to be genuinely interested in an unsolved case like this while also keeping the humanity of the victims firmly at the center of that interest? I think it is. I think that is what responsible engagement with true crime requires. But it requires conscious effort. And I think you, watching this, are capable of that effort. Tell me in the comments how you balance that, how you engage with the mystery without losing sight of the people. Let us do a final review of what we know, what we suspect, and what remains entirely unknown about the Axeman of New Orleans. What we know, sourced from public records, newspaper archives, and historical documentation. A series of axe attacks occurred in New Orleans between May 1918 and October 1919. The victims included Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Louis Bassumer, Harriet Lowe, Anna Schneider, Joseph Romano, Charles Cordemelia, Rosie Cordemelia, Mary Cordemelia, Steve Boca, Sarah Lauman, and Mike Pepitone. Multiple victims died, including Catherine Maggio, Harriet Lowe, Mary Cordemelia, and Mike Pepitone. In multiple attacks, entry was gained by chiseling out a panel of a back door. An axe, often taken from the premises, was the weapon used. Many but not all victims were Italian-American grocers or store owners. A letter claiming to be from the Axeman and threatening death while offering to spare homes playing jazz was published in the Times-Picayune on March 13, 1919. No attacks were reported on March 19, 1919, the night referenced in the letter. Yolando and Frank Giordano were convicted of the Cordemelia attack and later exonerated after Rosie Cordemelia recanted her testimony. No individual was ever identified, charged, or convicted in connection with the Axeman attacks. The case remains officially unsolved. What investigators suspected but could not prove, that all or most of the attacks were committed by a single individual operating with a consistent method. That the attacker had some familiarity with the layout of the targeted residences. That the targeting of Italian-American grocers was deliberate rather than coincidental. That the jazz letter may or may not have been written by the actual attacker. What remains entirely unknown, the identity of the attacker, the motive for the attacks. Whether the same person was responsible for all of the attacks or whether some were carried out by others who had learned of the method through press coverage. Why the attacks stopped in October 1919. Whether the jazz letter was authentic correspondence from the killer or a hoax by an unknown third party. After more than a century, that is the honest accounting of what we know and don't know. The Axeman of New Orleans remains one of the most genuinely mysterious figures in the history of American crime. Not mysterious in a romanticized sense, but mysterious in the plain and frustrating sense that the evidence that exists cannot answer the most basic question: who was he? The city of New Orleans has changed enormously since 1919. The neighborhoods where the Axeman struck have evolved. The Italian-American community that was so deeply affected by these attacks has integrated fully into the broader fabric of New Orleans life. The jazz that the Axeman reportedly demanded has become one of the most celebrated and globally recognized American contributions to world culture. The newspapers that covered the case with such intensity are themselves now historical archives, their pages yellowed and digitized, available to researchers who want to trace what was known and when. And somewhere in that history, in those archived pages, in those old police reports, in the memories that have been passed down through generations of New Orleans families, the identity of the Axeman may still be waiting to be found. Or it may not be. The evidence may simply not exist in any recoverable form. The Axeman may be, in the truest sense, a mystery without a solution. But that does not mean the case is without meaning or without lessons. It tells us something important about the resilience of communities under threat. About the dangers of panic and false accusations. About the limits of investigative tools and the ways those limits can allow a guilty person to escape accountability. About the strange and persistent human impulse to make sense of senseless violence, to find a pattern, a motive, a reason that explains the inexplicable. And it tells us something about memory and culture. The Axeman demanded jazz, the city played jazz, and more than 100 years later, the city of New Orleans still plays jazz, in the streets, in the clubs, in the second-line parades, in the concert halls and the corner bars. The music that a killer tried to weaponize survived him. The community he terrorized survived him. The city he haunted survived him. And the victims he harmed, those whose names we have spoken tonight, are remembered now not simply as victims, but as people who were part of a community that endured. The Axeman of New Orleans. His identity unknown. His crimes documented, his case unsolved, his letter preserved in the archives of a newspaper he used to threaten a city. And his victims, always, remembered. If you think you know what happened, if you have a theory about who the Axeman was, or why he stopped, or whether that jazz letter was real, drop your theory in the comments. We go through every comment, and this is exactly the kind of case where thoughtful analysis from people who have really engaged with the details can open up new angles worth exploring. And if you found this case as compelling as we do, please like this video, subscribe to True Crime Mysteries, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. We have new mysteries coming all the time, and every one of them is a story that deserves to be told and remembered. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.